Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from the great state of Tennessee is my friend Colonel Ed Lowe. And I just wanted to call you Colonel, even though you're retired. I call you Colonel.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here with you.
It is great to have you with us. Now, Ed is, I hope I'm not spilling the beans here, recovering from some hip surgery. I hope
Yep.
things are going well for you.
They're going well. Starting to walk now, and starting to get my legs underneath me, and so it's been about 4 weeks now, but I'm right on track, so appreciate it.
Awesome. Now, not that any of our listeners would be of a demographic where they might be having hip surgeries themselves, right? Any advice you'd want to pass along to someone who hypothetically might be going through that?
Don't wait. Don't wait. It got to the point where I couldn't even cut the grass. I mean, it was just the pain was pretty bad. So, the doctor always told me, it says, it's not a matter of if, but when you want it done. When you can no longer tolerate the pain. And so I guess my advice would be, don't wait till you get to that point, do it before. But I was in and out, I was home the next day, and it was good. Went very well. So
Uh,
thanks.
Congratulations. Well, I'm going to be selfish a little bit and say that I'm glad that you're a little laid up because that's more time for you to do some of your great writing, which, of course, the Emerging Civil War series has benefited from.
Thank
So,
you.
we're going to talk a little bit today about your book,
Yeah,
Fine Opportunity Lost.
right.
Longstreet's Knoxville campaign, but I know you've
Yeah.
got some other things in the works. We'll talk about in a second. But uh, tell me a little bit about James Longstreet and the Knoxville campaign.
Oh wow. God, where to start? He comes down in early September from Virginia. Participates in the Battle of Chickamauga in September 18th, 19th, and 20th. And then, of course, we have, William Rosecrans, the Army of the Cumberland goes into Chattanooga, and then we have that kind of partial siege take place. Grant comes into Chattanooga in mid-October. And then, of course, we had the Browns Ferry action on October 27th. A couple days later, we have the Battle of Wauhatchie, which was that failed night action that Longstreet, conducted his troops. And then at the end of October, we have Jeff Davis and Braxton Bragg have a conversation, and the recommendation is, hey, why don't you send Longstreet up to tackle Burnside and his Army of the Ohio? And less than a week later, Longstreet and his two divisions and some cavalry from Wheeler and Alexander's artillery are heading north up towards Knoxville, and that's how it all kind of started there. Even Grant was kind of mystified that Bragg would release his most, his truly tested and veteran commander of Longstreet and just move him away from Chattanooga. But that's how it kind of started. And then the East Tennessee campaign takes place, and that's kind of what the book covers.
Now, you call the book A Fine Opportunity Lost. That comes from a quote about the sort of the frustration that results from this campaign.
Exactly.
Um, what was the opportunity that got lost and why?
Well, yeah, it's pretty prophetic. It's the second week of November, and he and Bragg are going back and forth with their communications. It's really quite comical, actually. They're blaming each other for logistical issues and transportation and railroad issues and all that. And Longstreet basically sends a message to Bragg saying, to paraphrase, this is simply going to be another fine opportunity lost. As he was kind of looking into the future of what this campaign was, what the results of that campaign were going to be, because he forecasted, because of lack of supplies, because of lack of support and logistics, that he could just foreshadow that this was simply just going to be, quote, again, another fine opportunity lost, which is essentially what it was. And that's kind of how he looked back on that in his memoirs, and a lot of frustration. And that certainly got to the point where at the end of December, he even offers his resignation to Richmond authorities because of what happened at Fort Sanders and some of the actions, because he had his own internal squabbles. We all very familiar with Braxton Bragg and his, the Army of Tennessee and some of the challenges he had within his command structure. But, we see some of that also kind of percolate to the top in Longstreet's organization as well in East Tennessee. Uh, and you can certainly tell a lot of frustration, a lot of angst with how operations took place. But again, back in early November, he kind of saw that this is, well, I think this is how it's going to be. So,
You have laid out an excellent framework for us. Lots of stuff to unpack there. Um, and I'm sure some people kind of look at Longstreet's forecast as doom and gloom, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, of course, it's going to fail because you're predicting its failure. In the same way that on July 2nd at Gettysburg, oh, of course the attack's going to fail because you don't want to do it. But yeah, I think you make a pretty good case in your book that Longstreet really saw a fantastic opportunity, and it's almost as though Bragg intentionally undercut him with some of the logistics, which how much of the logistics issues were real, how much were self-inflicted, how much of them were spiteful. There's a lot of stuff going on there.
well, he gets up to Sweetwater, which is just north of Chattanooga, maybe about 45 minutes, just north of Chattanooga. And he meets up with Carter Stevenson, Confederate Division commander that Bragg had sent up there to kind of keep an eye on Burnside. And when Longstreet gets up there, he has a conversation with Stevenson, and Stevenson tells him all the supplies that they have gathered are going back to Chattanooga. Well, Longstreet is incredulous. He's like, what do you mean? I mean, I have no knowledge of the terrain here. The foraging is very difficult, very challenging. And you're telling me that all these supplies that have been gathered are heading back to Chattanooga and I can't utilize them. And I think that's just one example of the frustration that Longstreet was up against, or that resulted from that decisions made with regard to supplies. And the railroads, Moxie Sorley called them a comical. They were how they comical in their inefficiency is how he quoted the railroad system there that goes up to Knoxville and through Loudon and on up into East Tennessee. So he was, the rail system there was challenging also to get the troops out of Chattanooga, but then the sheer logistics foraging for both the men and the horses and everything was almost non-existent. It was very difficult, very challenging. And plus the rain, the weather was turning. It rained quite a bit. Um, but give some credit to Burnside too. And I think we'll get into that a little later as well.
Yeah.
Maybe he redeemed himself a little bit after Fredericksburg in this campaign.
Now, and at the crux of this too is this fraught relationship between Longstreet and Bragg. And on one hand, it's easy to maybe just chalk that up to, Bragg doesn't get along with anybody. But I think Longstreet's probably a special case in that regard. Tell me a little bit about that relationship.
Plus, after Chickamauga on the 20th, when Rosecrans is heading north to Chattanooga, Longstreet kind of presses Bragg to, hey, let's finish this up. Let's keep up the fight. And Bragg elects to be a little more reserved. And of course, we have the anti-Bragg cabal, the coalition with Leonidas Polk and some of the other commanders that are already there. That a lot of their history with Bragg goes all the way back, in the Army of Tennessee before Longstreet arrived. And some of the research I conducted, that Longstreet kind of became the de facto leader of this anti-Bragg coalition. At the end of
And I think
September.
part of that is because he's got like a little bit of untouchableness about him because he still
Exactly.
reports to Lee, not
Yeah.
Bragg necessarily.
Yeah.
So the realm of authorities are a little is hazy.
And these letters start flying off to Davis and James Seaton, the Secretary of War for the Confederacy. And pretty much on October 9th, Jeff Davis is so uh, frustrated himself that he even comes down to Chattanooga and has a conversation with Bragg and these commanders about what is going on in the Army of Tennessee. But I think one author I talked about it in my research, that he could have replaced Bragg, but who was he going to replace him with? Not a lot of good options, I think, is what Stephen Woodward talked about. The relationship between Davis and Joseph Johnston, never was very good. But in some, Longstreet may have shot himself in the foot if he was looking for an independent command, maybe take over from Bragg. Um, he may have hurt his chances of that based on some of his frustration and letters to the authorities in Richmond, criticizing Bragg. I think he said, to quote, that nothing but the hand of God can save us now. Why can't you send us Lee? Send us Lee. Kind of those words, and that's kind of what prompted Davis to come down to Chattanooga and find out what the heck is going on in the Army of Tennessee.
Now, I
Uh,
try not to be too judgmental, but that Davis round of meetings seems like one of the most dysfunctional, I'll use the word idiotic rounds of meetings because he hauls Bragg in
yeah.
along with these commanders,
Oh
and then
God.
he'll look at Longstreet with Bragg sitting in the corner and saying,
Corner, I
"Tell me
know.
what you think about Bragg," and like,
Uh,
what are these commanders supposed to say?
I mean, I served 26 years in the Army. I cannot imagine a scenario where a situation like that would develop and you'd have that kind of command structure and commanders in place and, civilian authorities there. And then the commander, like you said, sitting in the corner in a chair, just kind of sulking. And, they're pressing, because Davis starts off with Longstreet, presses Longstreet to really, Longstreet certainly initially wants to defer. He, doesn't really want to answer, but Davis presses and, kind of the rest of the officers kind of follow suit. And then of course, you jump forward a couple weeks after uh, Davis has left, you have Brown's Ferry that falls. Again, like I mentioned, Wauhatchie, and Bragg is just very upset that Brown's Ferry fell in fell, uh, you know, was a loss to the Union soldiers in the first place. And the night action Wauhatchie just kind of sealed the day for Longstreet. And then of course Davis recommends to Bragg. He's the one that recommended that in a circular and a message to Bragg. Why don't you send Longstreet up against Burnside? And of course, like I said, less than a week later, he's gone. He's gone. And I think Grant, even his memoirs, kind of what you talked about initially, that if Longstreet had defeated Bragg or Burnside, Army of the Ohio, if he had gone up quickly and taken care of Burnside and then come back to Chattanooga, I think Grant in his memoirs actually even states that he would have been lucky to have gotten out of Chattanooga alive. Uh, so there are that second, third order effects, and I know the Emergency Civil War put out a good book on the what ifs of the Civil War, and that could have been something. What if Longstreet had defeated Burnside and Longstreet was there in Chattanooga? How would that have looked? And then the domino effects of all that, going into the campaign of '64. If Chattanooga falls back to the Confederacy and Grant, does his star diminish in Lincoln's eyes? Does he become general in chief in March of '64? And where does Sherman's march to Atlanta begin? Is it Dalton? Is it Chattanooga? Or does he have to start all the way up in Nashville? So all kind of what ifs.
Yeah.
But hey, that's what it is. So
Well, the question gives us a great opportunity to sort of explore, well, what was really going on and what was happening and what were the implications. So,
yeah,
sort of, I think makes the history much more alive and relevant
yeah.
because it's not predetermined when you're looking at it
And
that way.
I think it ties also to Burnside. Like I said, some credit to Burnside. Maybe self-serving afterward, but he said, "Hey, the best way I can support Grant is to pull Longstreet away from Chattanooga." And at the Tennessee River there in Loudon, when the river crossings commence, his commanders go to him and say, "Hey, we can, a major river crossing is a very tough obstacle. If you're the attacker and trying to cross and in the face of artillery fire and uh, enemy soldiers on the far bank. Even in today's military, river crossing is very tough."
Right.
Burnside comes down to Knoxville, says, "No, guys, we're just going to withdraw slowly. We're going to pull Longstreet away from Chattanooga, and then up in Knoxville. Then, of course, we have all the operations that take place there, Fort Sanders, and of course, you know, 23 in November we have the battles of Chattanooga take place. So
And I want to get into Burnside in a minute because he's a fascinating guy, and this is, I think, as you say, is sort of his chance to redeem himself. But yeah, as I bring the book back, we've got Longstreet right on the cover, and it's like
yeah,
James Longstreet's. Ooh, there we go.
there
James
you go.
Longstreet's East Tennessee. So it's
Yeah,
very much a Longstreet story,
yeah.
as the way you tell it. Just in general, what do you make of Longstreet?
Man, I I've given a lot of tours at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and people who kind of focus on the Eastern Theater, they see Longstreet, of course, at Gettysburg in July of '63, and then all of a sudden he reappears in May of '64. And when I talk about Longstreet at Chickamauga, they're almost like, what? He was here? He was in North Georgia, really? Which I think is why this book is really kind of interesting, because a lot of people don't realize that, hey, he was part of the Western Theater, or for a period. He came down to Chickamauga and Chattanooga, and then of course East Tennessee. But I think to your question, um, yeah, that's a great question. I think tactically, I mean, we look at uh, you Second Manassas, and his preparedness, his uh, always wanted to make things certainly dress and really in place. And I think we see that really personified at the Battle of Fort Sanders. He was waiting for everything to be in place before he attacked. He wasn't going to take any chances. He did not want to rush things, I guess. And there is some criticism, I think justified, with in particular that attack on Fort Sanders, that he waited too long, almost a week before he got up there, before he attacked. And the weather had some accounts, but there were some other factors. And the accounts in my research from civilians, Confederate sympathizers there in Knoxville, they were hoping he would attack soon, from non-commissioned officers in his organization that were saying, "God, we should have pressed right away." Uh, just that. But I think also I think one of his biggest tactical mistakes that he made in the East Tennessee campaign was not uh, fully embracing situational understanding of the surrounding territory, of the geography of the land around in Knoxville. What I mean by that is he did not clearly understand the river networks around Knoxville, and we probably would get to this later, but I'll go ahead and mention it now. He mistakenly thought that a river that was east of Knoxville, the French Broad River, was actually to the south, and he thought he had Knoxville fully encircled, and so the Burnside could not get supplies brought in from, because East Tennessee was very very pro-Union, pro-U.S., and so the surrounding counties there. But even in the face of civilian Confederate, those who were sympathetic to the Confederate cause, that went to Longstreet's headquarters and said, "Sir, the French Broad River is right here, and you do not have that encircled. You do not have security of that river, and if you don't secure it, they're going to be able to float supplies down into Knoxville, and Burnside's going to gather those." He ignored that. He ignored that intelligence, and that's what it was. It was intelligence. Because I think his stubbornness, and he says, "No, I am right and you are wrong. I didn't." And this is two or three civilians that were telling him this. Said, "General Longstreet, this is the situation here, and you need to, pay attention to this." But he ignored that. I think that was his biggest error in the East Tennessee campaign. Was not was that, and sure enough, the civilians were able to float down supplies at night. They had a Burnside put a boom across the river, and he was able to collect some supplies that were floated down. So again, a tactical and even operational mistake, I think, that Longstreet made.
Because I know Longstreet from being out here in the East, and he's someone I've come to admire a lot. I like him. He seems like he'd be a personable guy. I'd want to hang out with him and have a cigar. Um, and I think of him as such a powerful offensive commander when he's going on the attack, and when he shows up there at Chickamauga, he demonstrates that. But then when his role gets away from sort of that tactical, he seems to really flounder in East
Yeah.
Tennessee for all these reasons you've talked about, from logistics and command and weather and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But he just doesn't seem to quite be the kind of person who can turn that stuff around.
Right. I agree. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
So we've talked a little bit about the conflicts he has with Bragg and those command issues, but he also, aside from having problems upward, he has problems downward as well,
Yeah.
starting with his division commanders and brigade level stuff. And that becomes a huge dysfunctional problem for him that
It
cripples him in a
does.
lot of ways too. Tell me a little
Yeah.
bit about some of that.
I mean, that's probably his biggest headache in the winter and going in the spring of 64. Yeah, I mean, you go to Gettysburg, you go to Little Round Top and Devil's Den, and you see those words that just jump out: Jerome Robertson and Evander Law and Lafayette McLaws, at the Peach Orchard, just these names synonymous with the Army of Northern Virginia. I mean, that's who you see. And after Fort Sanders in mid-December, we have some unraveling, I guess, of that command structure in Longstreet's course, some dysfunction, dissatisfaction. He relieves Lafayette McLaws, who was really the tactical on-the-ground commander for the attack on Fort Sanders. He relieves Lafayette McLaws on, like I said, in mid-December for the failure for 3 charges were pressed against Lafayette McLaws. One, not having sharpshooters properly aligned with the attack. The organizational structure of the attack was not suitable to Longstreet. And then, of course, the big one, the one that actually stuck during the court martial, was failing to provide proper, equipment to cross the obstacles that made up Fort Sanders. Of course, the famous ditch that was there around Fort Sanders that was not taken into account fully as it should have been. But McLaws is blamed for that. He's court-martialed for that. And at the end of the day, as this court-martial gets postponed into 64, Samuel Cooper, who was the Adjutant General, Inspector General of the Confederacy, and James Seaton, they just get frustrated, and he's found guilty. McLaws is actually found guilty of the latter charge of failing to provide the proper means to cross the obstacles there at Fort Sanders. He's suspended 60-day suspension of rank and pay, but it's overturned. It's dismissed, but he is out of Longstreet's corps. I think in the middle of May, he heads down to Georgia and the Carolinas to kind of help with the defenses there. Jerome Robertson is kind of the next one, that led the famous Texas Brigade, and
But before we move on to
Yeah.
Robertson, let me ask you sort of the hot button question with McLaws: scapegoated or not?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I really do. Legitimate concerns. He pressed that. He even writes to, I think it was Cooper. He says, if Longstreet, if I am charged with failing to provide the means to cross the obstacles there at Fort Sanders, and Longstreet had it at his means to provide those, but he didn't. Okay, so there was a lot of frustration back and forth. And actually, after the war, Longstreet writes McLaws, I think in the late 1870s, and basically apologizes, says, I relieved you, quote, in an unguarded moment. So there is some regret from Longstreet for that action, but I don't think McLaws really truly forgave him for that. But and certainly some of the other commanders, Micah Jenkins, for example, who was leading Hood's division at the time, and that's another story that too there with who was going to command Hood's division, because Hood is wounded once again at Chickamauga, and Evander Law had taken that division, from July 2nd when Hood was wounded, down through the first day at Chickamauga, and then Hood's wounded again. And then we have also part of that command structure frustration was who was going to command that division. This went back and forth. Micah Jenkins, Evander Law. Davis would not settle that until got early mid 64, and that became also a sense of tension amongst the troops. Anyway, Micah Jenkins, the day before the assault on November 29th, goes to Lafayette McLaws and Porter Alexander, says, "Hey, we need something to be able to cross the ditch with. We don't have ladders or other mechanisms," and they just I don't want to say dismiss him, but they just say, "Hey, we'll take care of it." And he writes Longstreet, and Longstreet basically says, you have to have a positive attitude. If we plan to fail, then that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to fail. So go in with the spirit of victory, and you'll be fine. And of course, the result is what it is, and the troops get stuck in that ditch, and McLaws is, he's to blame for that, because he was tactical on a scene commander for that attack.
And then you mentioned Jerome Robinson. I interrupted you a second ago, but that gets super messy.
That gets messy. There was, and this goes back to operations inside Chattanooga at the Battle of Waxahachie. Longstreet actually relieves Robertson because of some actions there during that night battle, but restores him back to command because of, hey, they're moving out towards Knoxville. But the Battle of Bean Station, which took place on December 14th, Micah Jenkins is just extremely frustrated with Robertson. Robertson is frustrated with the campaign itself. Basically refuses any orders unless they are in writing, and just becomes very uh, incredulous to the entire campaign itself. Micah Jenkins wants to remove Robertson from command. Longstreet agrees, and the same court martial that saw McLaws did the same thing. There's nothing in writing that I could find that talked about those proceedings, but either way, Robertson is removed from command. John Gregg takes command eventually of the Texas Brigade, and Jerome Robertson is shipped off to Texas to kind of organize the state militia. So now you got McLaws and Jerome Robertson out of the picture. Then of course the next one is Evander Law. And again, at the Battle of Campbell Station, which took place on November 16th, just after crossing the Tennessee River there in Loudon, Battle of Campbell Station occurs. Law is given a key mission to kind of head off towards Burnside's left flank there, and he gets kind of misoriented and ends up really in front of the Union lines, and the attack falters. Law and Micah Jenkins blame Micah Jenkins and Longstreet blame Law for that missed opportunity, and Longstreet never forgives Law for that. There's also some criticism back towards operations back in Chattanooga, but that's 2 strikes against Law according to Longstreet. We have Chattanooga, and then we have the failed action at Campbell Station, which doesn't go as they would have liked. Law's missions there. And so at about the same time that McLaws is relieved, Law wants to resign from the Army, and he wants to move over and join the cavalry for the Confederacy, and he wants to take his resignation to Richmond. And Longstreet says, "Okay, you've earned it. You've been of good service." But then while Law is gone, kind of a long story short here, Longstreet gets wind that maybe Longstreet was going for other purposes, nefarious reasons why
Law was going for nefarious.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's very upset and talking to some of Law's commanders, and he thinks, yep, this is not right. And so Law goes up to Richmond, sees John Bow Hood, who's recuperating, and Hood convinces Law, hey, you don't do this. Don't turn in your resignation. So Law destroys the paperwork, tears it up, gets back on a train, heads back down to East Tennessee, and Longstreet has him immediately arrested, and piles a second charge for destroying official Confederate paperwork, because his resignation or transfer request was written on official Confederate paperwork. So he destroys that. So Longstreet is out to get him. And you got McLaws, you got Robertson, and the Richmond authorities are just like beside themselves. Like, not again. We don't want this. Here we are once again. Samuel Cooper relieves him from arrest, and Longstreet arrests him once again. After he's removed from that, Longstreet arrests him again a second time, and he's basically telling Richmond, hey, either Longstreet go, or either I go or Law goes. Make a decision. And of course, the bloody spring campaign season is fixing to start. Robert E. Lee gets involved. He says, hey, maybe we ought to do some kind of investigation into this. But that's how kind of all that transpired. And actually McLaws and Law had joined up to kind of conspire against Longstreet, with Law kind of focusing on the operations around Chattanooga and maybe Campbell Station, and McLaws kind of focused on Knoxville and the rest of the campaign, because Bragg by that time was gone from the Army of Tennessee. He had left in early December. And so he was kind of a senior advisor to Davis, I think, by that time. But all was a moot point, because, of course, Longstreet is wounded at the Wilderness on May 6th, and Law remains in command, remains part of the Army, but he is wounded at the Battle of Cold Harbor, and he eventually does get his request to join the cavalry. And I think he ends up with Johnston, there in North Carolina when the war ends.
Yeah, I
But
mean, it seems like there are no winners to this whole thing because, like,
oh,
Micah Jenkins, he gets the division command, he
oh
gets
yeah,
killed at the Wilderness.
yeah,
John Gregg, who takes over the Texas Brigade, ends
yeah,
up getting killed down
yeah.
Petersburg. I mean, there are no winners.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I think really, I think that's why at the end of December, I think that's why Longstreet submitted his resignation. I mean, because all these, with all three of these commanders occurred like 2 weeks before, and you got Fort Sanders, that failed attack there. I think, Longstreet just kind of said, you know what, I think maybe another commander ought to be tried here.
uh,
But of course, that it doesn't take place, and kind of the rest is history. So
I think even McLaws petitions to come back in May 15, 16, somewhere in
mm,
there. Lee's like, no, we'll leave you where you're at.
yeah,
Like, and like
yeah,
nothing works out there.
yeah,
So Longstreet goes out west with such high hopes, shows up at Chickamauga at the right place at the right time to turn the tide of battle. Things just start on such a positive, hopeful note for him.
yeah,
And then by the end of the winter, he's in such a different place.
yeah.
And you mentioned even offers at one point to resign. Um, put me in his headspace by the time just before he's ready to come back to the Army of Northern Virginia. Like, put me in his headspace for a second.
I've read one account, and um, I haven't been able to verify it, but um, one account that from one of his aides that said Longstreet was very much satisfied and very much content to be back under the umbrella of Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. And you kind of glean from that, I'm glad to be out of East Tennessee. Um, and the order to move Longstreet back to Lee's Army in Northern Virginia comes in on April 7th. They held a big review at the end of April, with Longstreet's guys back, and of course Lee is just ecstatic to have Longstreet back, and all the accounts I read from some of the veterans of the East Tennessee campaign were just absolutely thrilled to be back and to see Lee and Longstreet back together again. But I don't think there's any question. I think that Longstreet was very much glad and satisfied to be back with the Army of Northern Virginia. I think he was glad that East Tennessee is in the shadows now. It's in the background, and they can go forward. Of course, less than a week later, he'll be debilitated, be wounded, and be out of action for several months. You know,
So a lot of people are probably going to come look at your book. Um, I'll hold it up again. Find opportunity loss, and kind of the battles around Knoxville sort of being the centerpiece. But to me, all of this personnel stuff, which
yeah,
happens kind of after the battles and the aftermath, was just absolutely fascinating. You did a
yeah,
wonderful job unpacking that. I'll give a pitch here to Elizabeth Veron's Longstreet biography, which is a great book. But I will say, I think she actually could have benefited from some of the stuff that you discussed in your book about these interpersonal things that result from stuff that happened on the battlefield, because you do such a great job of getting into why these things happened and how they happened. And that might have just sort of given her book just a little extra dimension on some of those things that she didn't quite get into.
yeah. To me, I think that's the most fascinating aspect of the entire East Tennessee campaign is that personal, that command relationships that he had with his, like you said, his, with Bragg, and then also his subordinates, because as a retired colonel, having soldiers and officers, below me at given times, that can be hard. That can be very difficult. You got to make those decisions, and uh, part of the research I really enjoyed the most was diving into this kind of philosophical and kind of his command philosophy, I guess, and kind of to see some of that unravel in East Tennessee. I would venture to say he probably had some regrets about some of the decisions he made. I think McLaws being an example that I talked about earlier. He kind of regretted that. Um, but command is lonely at the top, and that is surely the case. With Longstreet in East Tennessee, he was the man, he was the guy, and it was tough going. And I think, like you said, at the initial, the logistical aspect, which got better a little bit in early 1864. Some of the railroads got back up and running, but it was still very difficult, very challenging. The cold weather it just proved a harbinger of difficulties that he was having to face. I think it just got to him like it does almost any commander.
So we've mentioned Ambrose Burnside, the affable, bewhiskered Ambrose Burnside, and I kept saying we're going to talk about him in a second. We're going to talk about. So let me just shift gears and let's talk about him a little bit, because this, generally we've approached this as a Longstreet story, but uh, to paraphrase George Pickett, I think the Yankees had something to do with this too.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about Burnside and kind of his presence in this story.
Well, he comes down from Kentucky, takes over, takes Knoxville in early September of '63. Kind of becomes a thorn, I guess, in the side of Braxton Bragg, kind of there lurking in the shadows as Chickamauga and Chattanooga is taking place, and of course as Longstreet moves forward to approach. Burnside makes a decision, and like I mentioned earlier, he basically said, and Grant was certainly on November 14th. Grant to Burnside said, East Tennessee must be held, because East Tennessee was very pro-Union, like I said, and probably something that I really need to underscore is very important is throughout October, November, President Abraham Lincoln, especially when Grant came into Chattanooga, he always continually reminded Grant, remember Burnside, remember Burnside. Almost daily. I think even his memoirs, he talks about it was very consistent that Lincoln was reminding him about what Burnside was going through. And so I think that the political aspect of that, I think, is pretty fascinating. And I think Burnside understood that. And I think ever the more reason why he thought the best thing he could do tactically, operationally, and even strategically is to pull Longstreet away from Chattanooga and utilize the resources he has and conduct the operations that he did. And I think both houses of Congress gave him applauded his efforts, which I think was a rarity. I think in the Civil War, both houses would do that. But he's gone. He actually leaves in the second week of December. He's replaced by John Foster. He had been ill for some time, had requested relief from command, but Lincoln, said, "Hey, the job's not finished yet." But I think after Fort Sanders and after Longstreet had kind of vacated Knoxville and headed up more towards Bristol and further in East Tennessee, Burnside was given his reprieve and his wish, and John Foster takes command. Of course, maybe to some extent, maybe to counter that, Grant sends William Sherman up to Knoxville because Burnside had been screaming, "Hey, we only have so many days of supplies left. We're starving here." And it's kind of interesting, kind of funny reading Sherman's memoirs, and then also some of Burnside's account of this, that Burnside holds a lavish dinner for Sherman in Knoxville, and Sherman is just furious. He's like, "Wait a minute, I thought you were starving here. Your soldiers are dying, and what's this dinner you're giving here? We're giving, providing here." And he just turns around and Burnside, "Well, we really don't need you. Why don't you head back, head back?" And Sherman says, "Yeah, I'm out of here." He leaves Gordon Granger's Fourth Corps, I believe, to remain in East Tennessee. I think Dave Powell talked about Granger wasn't too happy about having to remain there in the Knoxville area, but that's what Sherman did. But kind of an interesting kind of vignette, I guess, when Sherman arrives in Knoxville and Burnside.
What a great, I think a perfect illustration of the culture of the armies from the East versus the armies from the West. Because, even though
Yeah.
Burnside's in Tennessee, he's definitely a creature of the Eastern armies there for sure.
Yeah.
So if people were to come to your book, what's the one takeaway that you hope that they get from it? And there are many things to take away, but is there something particularly that you want them to take away?
Command is hard. Command is challenging. Command is difficult. You're dealing with a lot of personalities. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with, especially during that time, during the Civil War, East-West theaters, soldiers, officers, and all that. Command is difficult. Command is challenging, and decisions that you make have consequences, both positive and negative. Um, to me, again, like I mentioned, Longstreet's really failure to understand the situation around him in Knoxville, the failure to have this information about the river networks around Knoxville that really had a huge impact, a huge decision, failing to take into account the depth of the ditch, even in the face of evidence that, hey, it's much deeper than it was expected. Um, things like that, and stack those on top of each other. It can lend itself to some difficult days and a difficult fight. And I think it's almost ubiquitous throughout, the Civil War battles when commanders make decisions, either good or bad, what those results are based upon those decisions made. And I think we see that kind of play out day by day, week by week during the East Tennessee campaign.
Great, great. Now, I don't want you to let the cat out of the bag too much, but I know that you're developing this story into a larger work. Do you want to tease us just a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I've been working on this for several years with Ted Savis. That really follows Longstreet's First Corps from, I guess, when he was in Suffolk, when the Chancellorsville campaign, the Battle of Chancellorsville was taking place. His organization was absent from that battle. He was in gathering supplies there in Suffolk area, and the book really starts off from there. Takes his we go through, of course, the Battle at Gettysburg, and then of course the decisions made to move Longstreet south, because he always had an eye towards the Western Theater. He always had an eye towards Tennessee. Even before Gettysburg, he was like, the war, this is an important theater here also. We could do some damage here, because he's seeing what is going on between Bragg and Rosecrans in Middle Tennessee. The Tullahoma campaign in June, and Stones River, of course, in early 1863. He's seeing that all play out and says, I could probably do some good work there in Middle, make an impact on what's going on in Middle Tennessee. So he's an advocate of that. He proposes that, and early September he's gone. Of course, Pickett's division's chewed up, stays there in Richmond, and so we have those two divisions that I talked about initially. They head south, and of course the rest is. And the rest of the book covers, of course, in detail, the Battle of Chickamauga, operations around Chattanooga, and then, of course, starts off where this ECW book is really the focus, which is East Tennessee. And the book would conclude with his reuniting with Lee in time for the Overland Campaign, the Battle of the Wilderness. So it's a lengthy. I think the first draft was like 575 pages long, and Ted was like, "You need to chop that down. You need to cut that down." So I did, and I've had some great assistants. Dave Powell, was a big help. Ms. Sanders, like we talked about, was a big help in editing. Cecily, so just very good. And hey, I hope to have it back in Ted's hand maybe by the fall. Dr. Jennifer Murray is looking at it now.
Yeah.
Somebody I really respect and admire. She does great work, and get her comments back, and hopefully have it to Ted by the fall or early winter. So we'll see.
Oh, very good, very good. Yeah, you mentioned Longstreet having that eye out into Tennessee, and people forget that he was like a Joe Johnston acolyte, and
Yeah.
as he's coming back from Suffolk, right where you start the book, he's marching through Richmond and saying like, "Hey, I got the divisions of Pickett and Hood here.
Yeah.
Why don't you just send us out to link up with Johnston, and we'll just push up through Middle Tennessee and into Ohio. We'll go all the way through Kentucky and into Ohio." And
Well, yeah, it's funny. I mean, even in East Tennessee, he talked about. I think I mentioned this in the book. He wanted to mount his entire organization on horses and mules, and head up into Kentucky and Ohio, and of course, authorities are like, it's totally unrealistic, totally not feasible at all. But some of the authors that I've talked, that I read, said at least he was thinking strategically and operationally.
yeah,
He was thinking outside the box. He wasn't so focused. He was thinking of other ways. So give him credit there. Give him credit there.
Instead, he gets an all expense paid trip to South Central Pennsylvania.
That's right. Exactly.
So one thing I'll just say here as we wrap up, Ed, I get to work with a lot of historians, a lot of authors, and the pleasure to just work with a lot of smart and pleasant people. And I have to just give you a little kudo, pat on the back. You are one of the most pleasant gentlemen I've ever had the privilege to work with in this field. So thank
Well,
you for
thank you,
your
Chris.
good and
Means
your
a lot,
kind
sir.
work on this book. So
Means a lot.
Ed Lowe from Tennessee, thanks so
Okay.
much for being with us, pal.
Yes, sir. All
So
right.
the book again is A Find Opportunity Lost, James Longstreet's East Tennessee Campaign, part of the Emerging Civil War series from Savas Beatty. Ed, thanks for being with us.
Okay. Thanks,
I'm
buddy.
Chris.
Take care.
I'm Chris
Yes, sir.
Mikowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.